Jackson State is the only HBCU in the Stats Perform Preseason FCS Top 25, and I have a feeling that as more polls roll out, this trend won't change. Oh yeah, it's Locked On HBCU. Play my music.
You are Locked On HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I, of course, am Darrion Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald Sports editor and current site expert at Who Dat Dish and contributing writer at USA Today Saints Wire. Thank you for going on this journey with me. Make a Locked On HBCU your first listen of the day, every day. And remember, just because the mic cuts off does not mean that the journey is over. Just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Starts with an S and ends with an S. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. And right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if their first $5 bet wins. We'll wrap up today's episode by taking a look at Central State and how they're adding yet another NFL player, two actually, but one that I want to focus on, to their coaching staff. This is the type of staff that I think people were actually expecting from Norfolk State and Delaware State. In segment 2, Trenton Boykin is in his first year as the official head coach of Hampton. No interim tag on him in 2025, and he's still looking to form his culture. I like what his culture is built off of, but let's dive into exactly what that is on today's episode. But this whole thing kicks off with Jackson State. The cliche goes that it's lonely at the top, and Jackson State is quite familiar with that. Jackson State is being able to realize that as we speak, because you had the Stats Perform Preseason FCS Top 25 poll. Try to say that 5 times fast. But you have the Stats Perform Preseason FCS Top 25 poll. And the perception is that Jackson State is the only HBCU that is worthy of a top 25 spot. And I'm going to use that word perception early in this segment because to me, that's all that a preseason poll is. And I understand that it's based off of things. I understand it's based off recruiting, previous year's success, returning players. I understand all of those things go into it. But at the end of the day, the preseason poll does not mean much, especially if you're talking about in the HBCU world, right? Like if we were talking about something a little bit different, I think in the FBS is a different conversation. Because then you have, oh, they beat the preseason top 25 team or the preseason top 15. Like those things begin to mean a little bit more. And as you try to climb up the ranks, those things are used as your tools to climb or tools to knock you down. So I do think it's a little bit different depending on what you're speaking about. But if we're talking about HBCUs, it's all perception and it doesn't really matter, you know? So it doesn't really matter unless you have to get into the playoff conversation. Then it does matter with that. I will say that. But you don't ever want to do it unless you're A&T, Hampton, or Tennessee State. Those are not the things that you're aiming for. But the point is, the perception is what we're going to talk about today. Because today is not an episode about Jackson State being the top HBCU. I think we've said that enough times that I don't need to deliver a whole segment about it today. This is not about how they stand apart from the rest on the field. This is about how when people look at Jackson State, this is the only school that is worthy of being put with the top tier or with the upper echelon of FCS universities on the football field. That's what this is about. And I think the reason that that is the case is because Jackson State did win the Black College National Championship in 2024. And Jackson State did return a good amount of players. And Jackson State does have a coach who seemingly has a culture built that is, I would say it lends itself to repetition as far as success goes, not predicting a second back-to-back national championship, but at least another successful season from JSU. I think TC has built that. They have a quarterback that's looked at highly. right? So if you go through all of the boxes for Jackson State as a returning champion, they checked all the boxes. Check quarterback, got players in the trenches. You got all-American players coming back on your offense. You have a quarterback who's a Walter Payton Award watch list player. You have a coach. You have everything that tells me Jackson State can be a really good to elite team for yet another season. That's how they find themselves in the top 25. But like I said, this isn't about how they're better than everybody else. Why are they the only HBCU? No one's refuting that Jackson State should be in the top 25, but I think the question becomes, should have any joined him? Should have any HBCUs joined them? That's the question. And I'd say no. I don't think that anybody has earned that right to me. I think you may see it. You may see someone say, oh, we really like Central. We really like South Carolina State. But in my opinion, neither one of those universities have earned the right to say we're going to be a top 25 team in the preseason polls. Because once again, it's all about perception. And I'll really address South Carolina State more than anything else because I don't know what to expect from the Bulldogs in 2025. I don't. I love the coach. I do. I even have some belief in the quarterback. But as far as everything goes in totality, they're losing so much. They're losing so much. If you're looking at them as a team who was in the national championship just a year ago, while Jackson State returns a lot of critical players, let's not forget about that linebacker duo. I really do like Pulliam and Taylor, but that's not about them right now. While Jackson State is a team who is coming off of a national championship appearance, a national championship victory, they're also returning a bunch of players. That's how they find themselves in the top 25. Because when you return critical players such as Jacoby and Morgan, you're going to find yourself in the top 25 because that's where you ended. You were 18 last year. They wrap up the season at 18, and they open up the season at 17 in the preseason polls. But you look at South Carolina State, who is similar. They're coming off of a very dominant season. They're coming off of a national championship appearance and yet a loss. You don't knock them so much for the L. You more so knock them for all of the losses that they took in the offseason. Look, you look at South Carolina State, quarterback out of there. Your 3 wide receivers that were a big reason for your offensive success and the explosiveness on that side of the ball, all out of there. 2 to the portal, 1 to graduation. You're looking at a guy in Aaron Smith who was the leader, the vocal leader of that defense, an East-West Shrine Bowl player. He's out of there. You're looking at Broughton. You're looking at Hall. You're looking at these players on the end, at the edge. They're out of there. So when you're looking at South Carolina State, it's a whole lot of new pieces. And that's what makes it so difficult to predict. Yes, you have guys like Diego Addison. You have guys like Gerard Washington who are talented players in the back end. And on that secondary, I feel confident saying they'll be able to hold those guys down. But if I'm looking at the front 7, if I'm looking at the quarterback, I'm looking at the skill position, and all of those things are turning over, all of those things are new, it's very difficult for me to project, for me to perceive them as a top 25 team when it's really hard for me to project and how to perceive them as a team in general. Forget the rankings. But that's why it's perception. Because I'm not sitting here telling you that they're going to be bad. I just don't know if they inspire any confidence to be top 25. And that's a completely different conversation because it's all based on perception. One thing that's important here is to look beyond the top 25. When I tell you that as an HBCU, the top 25 isn't overly important, it's not something I'm going to stress about a lot, I mean that. I stand on that. But at the same time, it does come into play, especially if you're a school in the MEAC where you have a really high likelihood, if you're successful enough, to make the FCS playoffs, at least from a scheduling standpoint, right? In the SWAC, let's say Grambling or Southern is really good, or let's just say the second best team in the SWAC is a really good team, but they're not in the same division as the first best team, right? So Jackson State and Southern, for example, one's in the East, one's in the West. If Southern was the second best team in this conference, they're not making it to the playoffs because they're going to play in the SWAC championship game and miss out. Meanwhile, FAMU a couple of years ago, they were able to see themselves go to the playoffs because them and Jackson State were in the same division, so FAMU didn't have to play in the championship game. All of that goes out the window for the MEAC. Either you represent the conference in the Celebration Bowl or you don't. And everybody who doesn't has an opportunity to make it to the FCS playoffs. That's not necessarily the case in the SWAC. So when I look at these polls, I don't just look at the top 25. I also look at who received votes. I don't talk about it all the time because it feels a little participation trophy-ish to me. But at the same time, you see South Carolina State get votes. You see North Carolina Central get votes. And you see Tennessee State get votes. The reason I do pay attention to it, even if I don't talk about it, is because that tells me, A, preseason, who are the best HBCUs in the mind of the national media. And that's Tennessee State, North Carolina Central, South Carolina State, Jackson State. Why did I do it in that order, descending or ascending rather than descending? I don't know. But that's just how my brain was working, and I was reading them backwards. Tennessee State got the least amount of votes of the additional guys, North Carolina Central, then South Carolina State, right? So I don't know why I did it in ascending order. But the point is, when it comes to these schools, I'm always interested. Who do you think is going to be those guys, or who are those guys that you think are close but not quite there? Because it's very difficult to climb the rankings. South Carolina State did it last year by absolutely dominating and running through the Mid-Eastern. But not everybody's going to do that. You need to be close to be in those conversations. And Tennessee State getting votes for Stats Perform, North Carolina Central getting votes for this platform, I think it does make a difference in where you could see them go if they're not able to win the MEAC. They have a chance at being in that FCS playoff conversation. And the early perception tells me that that's the case. But let's push forward and let's look at Hampton, because Hampton is a school that is going into a new era. They're going into the Boykin era, and I don't actually talk about that new era enough. Let me rectify my mistake as we continue with Locked On HBCU. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, and FanDuel is the official sports book of the Locked On Podcast Network. Let me get that's my Ashton Genty, but he doesn't do it anymore. And I don't think you could really see me trying to do his iconic stance. I don't even know if I did it well, but one thing I do know how to do well is to go to FanDuel. I know how to go to FanDuel.com, and you know what? I'm jealous. I'm jealous of anybody who hasn't taken my advice yet, so you still get the bonus bets deal. I've been here. I'm tried and true. But if you're new to FanDuel, then you get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. It's simple. It's easy. I don't understand why you haven't done it, but hey, at least you get that benefit. NFL's back. You can bet on week 1. You can bet on week 1 right now. If that ends up being right, boom, you get $150 in bonus bets. Bet on tennis. You can bet on baseball. You can bet on WNBA. You can bet on whatever you want. Just put down $5. If it hits, you get $150 back in bonus bets. Go to FanDuel, make every moment more. As we continue rolling on today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day. For your second listen, make sure you're checking out Locked On NFL, because it's back. The best sport in the world, the greatest sport in the world. I'm not just talking America. I'm talking NFL worldwide. We got games in Brazil. We'll have a game in France. We have games in Mexico City. Anyway, this is not Locked On NFL, which if you want to hear somebody go on about the greatest sport in the world, more than I just did, of course, then you can go check out Locked On NFL. And in addition to telling you how great the sport is, they also talk about the preseason game. So all the rookies who are getting their first taste of action, go there to hear about them. Let me move on to our HBCU athletics, specifically Hampton, because Hampton is crafting a culture. And I think it's something that I have actually passed by, because Trenton Boykin being at Hampton for so long, right? He's been there for a few years now. I never really think about the fact that he's creating his own culture. In a recent quote that he had that was on HBCU Sports, but it was on let me see. I want to make sure I get that. Hampton. It was on MEAC and More with Chris Stevens on the HBCU Sports YouTube page. He gave a couple of quotes that made me realize, like, oh, wow, you know what? He is still forming his own culture because he's now taking the reins. This is not the same as, and I also have to credit one of the comments from a Jackson State fan talking about how TC Taylor was with Jackson State since 2019. and we were talking about the recruiting and how I don't necessarily consider those his recruiting wins, right? Until he became the head coach. Then those are his wins. Before that, it was Jackson State wins, in my opinion. So with that comment mixed with the kind of realization or being reminded that Boykin has been on the staff, but he's only been a head coach for a season, it's like, oh yeah, he has to form his own culture. And last year, he was an interim coach. This year, he's the full-time coach. This year, he's the guy. And this is what he had to say about trying to form that culture. He says, "We're still trying to put my footprint on this program. From where we started last May to now, you do kind of see the kind of young men that we want to recruit here and what we want to establish here. So we're going to get into the football aspect of this in a little bit, of course, but I do want to start off with the personal aspect of recruitment, because the kind of young men that you want, that's not the same in every single program. That is what, in my opinion, creates the culture, especially in college. We often talk about, we often talk about victories. We often talk about success and championships and what's your win-loss record. And we do that a lot. But at the same time, part of that conversation of culture goes beyond winning. We have to look at what creates wins. That's why when we see a coach who comes over from a successful program to now become a head coach, you say, oh, well, we hope that he brings some of those things with him, because that's culture. That's creating the wins. The wins don't just happen. That's not how that works, So when it comes to Boykin, he's saying, I'm still trying to put my footprint on this program. The reason I say we don't talk about it enough is this is exactly what I talk about when it comes to A&T and Sean Gibbs. This is always what I talk about with them. I have absolutely no expectations for the Aggies because Sean Gibbs is going into his first year leading the program. To me, that absolves you from all expectations, and it's almost like a setup for you to overachieve. That's almost what it feels like to me. But at the same time, Hampton is kind of going through that because Trenton Boykin is only a second-year head coach. Boykin hasn't come in and just said, this is my team and this is how it's going to be ran with these type of players. A lot of times people say it takes 2 to 3 years just for you to get your full footprint on a program. So this is something I feel like is I don't want to say under-discussed and speak for everybody, but for me, it's something that I have not paid enough attention to. I have not given enough attention to. Let's say that. But the other quote that I have is about the type of player he wants and specifically where they come from. He says, you always play harder for people you care about. Most of the guys that we have grew up within a 100-mile radius. We want to build that same mentality here. Virginia and the DMV have the best high school football, and we want to bring that attitude. I do believe that the idea that you compete harder for those that you care about, for something you care about. Let me bring in a story from a show that if you haven't watched it, please go watch it. It's called Warrior, and it's on Netflix. And there was a fight between two characters. I realize I can't spoil it if I tell you to go watch it. But there was a fight between two characters. And one guy, I think they're very equally matched, but one guy just wanted it more. He had something that he was fighting for. And that was the difference. One guy just wanted to win the fight. He wanted to be the best fighter. The other guy had a purpose. He had something that he was fighting for. And that made him push beyond a point that the guy who ended up losing could push to. And that's the best I could do it without actually spoiling who was fighting and who lost. But just know it's a phenomenal fight. It's the season finale of season 1. You should all go watch it on Netflix if you don't have it. If you have it. If you don't have it, hit me up. I'll give you my password. No, I'm just kidding. I wouldn't do that. But you should go watch it. Borrow somebody else's password or go to their house because Netflix is cracking down on password sharing. Anyway, the point is we have what type of players that they want. Guys who are local because they feel like they're going to fight for each other a little bit more. Cool, got you. I think that's a great strategy to a degree. It's innate motivation. But what about on the field? Right? All right, cool. You got guys who are going to fight for each other. What about on the field? He says, especially in this conference, your offensive line and defensive line, you have to keep growing in those areas. We were the number 1 rushing offense 2 years in a row, but we still say we could be better and deeper. Now, it makes me wonder, when he says better and deeper, is that specifically talking about your offensive line? Because if we're talking about the run game, I do wonder, are you going to be deeper? or are you going to be more shallow? The reason I ask that question is because you've seen a two-headed monster. It was Elijah Burris and Darian Butts for a couple of years. And then it was Elijah Burris and Jaquan Snipes. Now Burris is out of the picture. Burris had the most yards per game for the Pirates. But then you had Snipes, who had the most yards, period. And they weren't too far, but they were decent enough, right? Like you could tell that the distribution wasn't even between those players. And it was when Burris went down that Snipes really began to take off. And I want to go through that stretch because I can't help but wonder, is that what we're going to see from Snipes this year now that Burris is out of the picture? You had 8 for 71 against A&T. Great yards per carry, but you only had 8 carries. So let's get into the next 3 games where I'm really talking about the workload. Versus Elon, you have 18 for 106. Versus Villanova, you have 14 for 85. Against Towson, you have 22 carries for 80 yards. Now, you don't have any carries versus Albany. And these things all are going to play with what your eventual yards per game is, right? So that can be difficult. Same with Burris. You've seen that taken down because he had games where he had 1 carry. Snipes had 4 carry games, 5 carry games, no carry, 10. Like, it was just very sporadic. He had 10 for 117 against Howard. So that was a big time game. The battle of the real HU, he was dominant in that one. But the point is, when you're looking at the run game, I do wonder if you're going to say, Snipes, we're going to let you tote the rock, and you're going to be the bell cow guy. Instead of being a guy who is sharing the rock, he didn't even hit 100 carries last year. But we could see him hit 115, 120. If he's the guy, I do wonder if they say we're going to share. Because some players or some coaches just like to share. Some coaches just like to have a two-headed monster in the backfield. To each his own. And it's the last thing he said. He says, Boykin, we will always take pride in running the football. But the talent we're bringing in is different now. And it's what we need to take it to the next tier. I do wonder what that means, and I cannot wait to find out. Does it mean that we're going to run the football at a higher level, or does it mean that maybe we're going to step back because the guys we got coming in now, we can sling the rock, and we need to sling it in order to win? I don't know, but I'll be watching with that quote in mind. But let's push forward and wrap up quickly. Leon Washington is a coach at Central State. But the position he was given has caught me so far off guard that I don't even know how I should feel about it. Let's explore this as we wrap up today's episode of Locked On HBCU. As we're wrapping up today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day, making it all the way to segment 3. And I thank you 2 times for that. Thank you. Central State is kind of forming the coaching staff that I think people expected from Delaware State and Deshaun Jackson. They expected it from Norfolk State and Michael Vick. Like, I think they expected this type of coaching staff because Tony Weaver, who has four HBCU, former NFL coaches, or 3, not including himself. But you're looking at that. So, I'm sorry, I meant to say Tony Carter. I realized I messed that up. But Tony Carter has 3 HBCU coaches, or 3 coaches on his staff that come from the NFL ranks. You have Santonio Holmes, you have Leon Washington, you have Quentin Demps. And the fact that I remember and know all of these players speaks volumes to just how recently is that they played. They are all late 2000s, early 2010s guy. Gosh, I can get my timeline wrong. But when it comes to it, I think you would have expected Jackson to have 3 guys. He has Clinton Portis. You'd expected Michael Vick to have 2-3 guys. He doesn't have any. I'm not saying there aren't former NFL players on that staff, but as guys that played recently, guys that we kind of recognize their names, I know Leon Washington. I think Quentin Demps may be a guy who everybody doesn't know, but I remember Quentin Demps pretty well, right? Like, I'm not saying I can tell you all about his game, but his name was around quite a bit in my younger days. So I do feel like he was someone who maybe Washington, maybe Demps, maybe Holmes, if they played in the 90s or the 80s, we wouldn't be talking about them this way. I'm not saying that they're superstars. I'm not saying, like, Clinton Portis is a guy who He played a while ago, but his name is going to continue to ring bells. Marshall Faulk is out there at Colorado along with Warren Sapp. These are names that they are Hall of Famers. They're guys, or Clinton's not, but they're guys who are going to stretch beyond just the decade after they played. That might not necessarily be the case when it comes to Leon Washington, when it comes to Santonio Holmes, and when it comes to Quentin Demps. But if this was happening at Norfolk or if it was happening at Delaware State, I can guarantee you this will be a huge talking point. But because it's Division II Central State, it's not something we're discussing as much. But specifically, when it comes to Leon Washington, I don't know how, but this is the most interesting hire I've seen in a long time, because how did Leon Washington become the offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach for Central State? Nothing in his past, nothing in his background or his expertise suggests that he should be coaching quarterbacks. Nothing in his background suggests that he was on his way to being an offensive coordinator. And I'm not critical of this decision at all. I trust what Coach Carter is doing. I just feel like I have questions. Sometimes I see decisions and I'm like, how y'all do that? Or why'd y'all do that? It's just curious to me, because obviously, Coach Washington has shown them something. Obviously, Coach Washington has shown something that says he could lead the entirety of the offense. But let me go through who Leon Washington is. Leon Washington is a former running back at Florida State. I saw a pretty cool stat that in his senior season, he was the first and only player in the Bobby Bowden era to score a touchdown in 5 different ways: by run, by reception, by kick return, by punt return, and fumble recovery. Thought that was pretty interesting. As he got to the NFL, he scored rushing touchdowns, he scored kickoff touchdowns, and he did get a couple of receiving touchdowns as well. But he was mostly a running and returner. But primarily a returner is where he rose to prominence. So when you're looking at Leon Washington and what it is that he was able to bring to the game of football, it's not as a quarterback. I don't want to say it's not as an offensive coordinator, but it was as a special team guy. It's as a running back. And you would think that if he was joining the coaching staff, he'd be a special teams and running backs coach. That's what Quentin Demps is doing. He's the defensive pass game coordinator. Matter of fact, that's what Leon Washington did everywhere he went. Everywhere that Leon Washington has been, he was a special teams guy and he was a running backs guy, whether that was as a player or if that was as a Bill Walsh fellowship member, or if that was as a member on Limestone's Division II coaching staff in 2024, right? Or if that was as a part with the Detroit Lions. He's been involved with special teams and running backs every step of the way. And the decision to move him to the quarterbacks and to the offensive coordinator position is one that fascinates me. And I mean that in the most literal sense. Let's see what fascination means, and then we'll close out today's episode. We're going to look up the definition of fascination. Fascinate. It means to draw irresistibly the attention or interest of someone else. That's me. I am irresistibly attentive towards this move, and I just want to know how it works out. I would love if there was a press conference like, we think that Leon could be the head coach or be the offensive coordinator because of this. I don't know. And if it does end up coming out, someone tell me what you think about it, because the Mailbag Monday or the Monday Mailbox, think about changing the name. But we'll be back on that on tomorrow's episode or Monday's episode. So let me know what you think. In the meantime, in between time, until the next time that we hear each other, family, take care, stay blessed. Peace.